So we're going to start today with, after our discussion last week, which was sort of a way into this book, Unterwegs zur Sprache, on the way to language, where I said, look, I want to try a decontextualized approach to the text, just to see what it can say to us when we read it, when we try to engage with it in a direct sort of way. So to leave a little bit aside, not that we don't use that, but to leave aside a little bit the stance of the philologist who wants to find out what this text is about, but try to see if we can get into this, as we've seen in the chapter for today, the dialogue, get into Ein Gespräch von der Sprache, a speaking of language rather than speaking about language. Now what that would mean for us to do that, how to engage with the text like that. So that was what we talked about, and we talked about what this Gespräch is. We talked about some of the other ideas around Gespräch and dialogue. The name Buber came up. There's a hidden reference in the text today to Buber and his notion of dialogue. And then I had this little paragraph from Humboldt's text, Über den Dualis, on the dual form in language, where Buber also suddenly discovers this, Humboldt discovers this dialogic nature of language, as he calls it. And I said, look, he is still using, and other people said that too, if you read that passage, he's clearly speaking, Humboldt is clearly speaking the language of German idealism, is speaking the language of the subject-object relation. Heidegger has a lot to say about that in the dialogue that we have for today. But I also said, well, look, there maybe is a kind of relation. So we, rather than saying, oh, look, here we have Humboldt psychologizing away, and we can just put that on the scrap heaps of history. Maybe there is another relation to a text like that possible, which prefigures a little bit of relation to the text that we're talking about ourselves. And we can, I had maybe slightly gaudy metaphor of the comet, that this little insight into the dialogical, which starts in this one paragraph, lights up like a comet when it gets close to the sun, but then it loses itself in the psychologism and it withers away. But nevertheless, something came to light there, and that's also very much how Heidegger in this dialogue that we will talk about now talks about philosophy as a Gespräch, as a dialogue, and especially the relation of the kind of thinking that he is attempting, the relation between the kind of thinking that he is attempting and what he calls metaphysics, metaphysical thinking. So very often we have this cliché image of Heidegger. It was not entirely cliché, he contributed a lot to it himself, but we have this image of Heidegger as sort of casting all bisherige metaphysics away. That's all. Metaphysics is where we don't need to go. But in this dialogue, he says very clearly, well, no, it's not about that, but it's about hearing where metaphysics comes from, hearing how it speaks, and almost, well, I would like to put it in my own words, almost see what it's trying to say, although it doesn't. If you take it literally, where it doesn't say it goes wrong. And I think so. One of the reasons for choosing that Humboldt paragraph is to say that's exactly what's happening there. There is something that lights up about this conversational nature of thinking, or the dialogic nature of thinking. That all these words are wrong for Heidegger. It's Gespräch. I don't know how we can translate that literally into English. A bespeak or something, yeah. With bespoke and bespoken, that goes into the.
Gespräch just mean conversation or dialogue. I mean, in particular with this text here that we read for this week, I think that the dialogue is particularly important.
It's particularly important, that's right.
And towards the end, they talk about what they mean by Gespräch. Do they mean it in the ordinary sense, or do they mean it in the extraordinary sense?
Yeah. As a Zuspruch. So something is being said to. Language speaks, pulls us in it addresses us. Yeah. So, right? So language addresses us. So this Gespräch is an allowing yourself to be addressed and then a response or a yeah. Whereas dialogue, as a word, well, as a word. Yeah, I'm very happy with the word dialogue. I don't have a problem with the word dialogue, but as you could, if you take the atmosphere of Heidegger, then you would say, well, it's a little bit a verfallenes Wort. It's falling. It's because it's metaphysical, because it is a speaking through, dialogein. It's a talking through things. And he says right at the end, when the Japaner says, so Plato's dialogues are not Gespräche, then he says, well, I don't want to go there. Why? The way I read that remark is that he is trying to say there is a way to read the Platonic dialogues that shows them as coming from the essence of metaphysics. And so there is a way to retrieve them, as it were, or rescue them in a way. But yes, if you take them at face value, they are not Gespräche. So there is, as you said, there is an emphatic use of Gespräch, like a extraordinary use. But there's
Logos,
also
in essence.
Huh?
Logos, the idea of speech and the higher form of communication instead of the practical means. So logos, the essence.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, sorry, I don't think that he's trying to get at the idea of Gespräch is kind of a higher essence, because I think he's still, because he's very aware of Sprache being something that we do, Sprechen, it comes from Sprechen. So I think that's why he's set this up in a dialogue form. I know he doesn't call that. I think it's very interesting that he pointed out that he distinguishes between Gespräch and dialogue. But he uses this form in particular because he's trying to get us to think about that process of negotiation that happens when we talk to someone else. And that's very practical. And there are practical issues of translation that are addressed in the text as part of the Gespräch. So it's also a negotiation of practical issues of translation, communication, mutual intelligibility, as well as this kind of higher idea, this fascination with this higher idea of what language is.
So what's in between?
Well,
is it bad?
Why does there have to be something in between? What do you mean when you ask that?
You say that he's trying to explain or to enact two things at the same time through a very practical. It's a dialogue. I was wondering about why this is a dialogue. I find it very interesting. Exactly, especially in comparison to the text we read last week, which I found fascinating in terms of the fact that the author is in dialogue with you, the reader. So at some point last week about that specific paragraph, you were saying, he brings the idea so close to actually saying what I'm saying, but he doesn't say it. He never comes to it. Yes, but he forced you to come up with it, which is ingenious. So it's dialogue.
I'm almost best
and then he brings it together by saying, and then we have language as a medium. I found it ingenious in terms of craftsmanship. And then I was trying to understand why this is a dialogue, which I found fascinating as well.
Yeah.
Because a dialogue is a very Western thing as a form, a very European thing. And he's choosing a Japanese person and a European person speaking in the form of a dialogue about the essence of intercultural metaphysical dialogue, which is again a very interesting form. And I was actually wondering why this is a.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and it seems to me that we will keep that question as we go on. It seems to me that, as I said, I think this is a very stylized text. It's not, put the recorder on and and transcribed conversation. So it's stylized, but that's fine. There can still be a genuine encounter. I think the vragende, so Heidegger, the questioner, learns something that he didn't realize before in the context of the conversation, the Gespräch. And that has to do with this intercultural thing, intercultural is probably the wrong word, but has to do with how he comes to hear the word kotoba as the name of language. So yeah, okay, we can get that in. So let's keep that question. Why is it a dialogue? And why has he chosen that form? What does that say about what he's trying to say? This is somehow essential to the point he's trying to make about language. Yeah? And you said, yeah, so there is on one hand this, last time we called it mystical. Maybe let's stick with that word, whether it's correct or not, but there's this sort of mystical view of the extraordinary view of language. And then there is this very almost daily practical negotiation, as you call it, going on. How do I understand what you're saying? Can we get closer to each other or not? And there is this to and fro going on all the time. Yeah. There's also quite a bit of coquetry going on, I think. The vraag and is also one who really knows a lot of the answers already. So there is a kind of that's what we mean with stylization.
I'm sorry, maybe this is a stupid question, but the Japanese, is that his invention?
No, it
happened really.
It has really happened. Yeah. I didn't look up the details again. Maybe you know, but there was a visitor who was a student of Cookie.
Yeah.
But I forgot his name. But he actually came to visit, and he stayed a while. He visited on multiple occasions, and out of these multiple occasions, this as far as I understand, this text was produced. Yeah. But so we have on the one hand this daily thing and then this mystical thing, where I think there is a kind of, well, I don't want to go too quickly, but there's kind of almost like a Zen moment in it when it comes to the discussion of silence, stille, and schweigen, and it seems to me that is a kind of So the text sort of approaches this well-known Zen point that the mystical and the ordinary are the same. So the text tries us to get to a relation towards language, which in a way is the most commonsensical, everyday relation that we have. But we don't realize it. We go away from it in how we think, in how we think about language, and that's where we get into metaphysical categories. That's where we get into metaphysical questions around, the higher and the lower, or what is inside and how do I bring it outwards, how do I express it. All these things, this kind of metaphysical thinking about language. He's not even saying that it's wrong. He says to the vragen, says to the Japaner, no, that's all there, but there is something else. And that something else is the essence, the Wesen der Sprache. Last week we talked about the fact that essence is not really a good translation of Wesen. That's the essence of language, and that is something else. That is this being addressed and responding, and there are lots of things to be said about that. I find it very complex text in the end. But so these are what about other people? What about other people's views or themes that you want to highlight? Comment with your
It's very difficult from different cultures. I was reminded of Ashra, where critics talk a lot I feel they just write something to say something. like the Japanese doesn't dare to say, to give an explanation because that would, he has a lot on really. He's find it very difficult to explain it to somebody who comes from a Western thinking to explain it.
Yeah, it is almost as if the Japanese, so like, it's almost as if the Japanese, so there is a kind, they both, in the dialogue, it seems to me that they both go a certain way with respect to language, and these paths cross. So the Japanese starts with, oh, I don't have any concepts to talk about language, I need to come to Europe to learn specific concepts, otherwise, that's why, and then the Heidegger, the fragende says, do you really think that's a defect that you have? He's trying to say, no, that's actually good, yeah? And he gets, so through the conversation, and this is precisely what Heidegger is trying to say, I think, through the conversation, the Japanese learns to understand that attitude that he brings to the question of language and learns to leave it behind. And in leaving it behind, he can suddenly voice something, he can give eine Bestimmung at the end, when he's finally ready to say these words, by which the text indicates that not everything can be said at every point in time. That is already itself a kind of how the text evacuates itself in the face of the reign of technology. So we as readers also cannot just simply, I'll read it and now I've got it. He gets to the point where he can say these words in a way that are then understood. And at the same time, the fragende also has a journey in the text, because the fragende starts from the idea that the essence of language in the West is going to be something very different from the essence of language in the East. He says, Haus des Seins, Sprache is das Haus des Seins, language is the house of being. Is that what it's translated as? Yeah. House of the rising sun. And then he says, well, probably the European languages live in a very different house from the East Asian languages. And he gets to the point where he actually hears what kotoba means, and he sees that it is what he is trying to say with respect to the Zug, the relation, the relation is the wrong word, the Bezug. So the sagen, kotoba is really sagen, properly understood as the moment where ontological difference, the difference between being and beings, lights up. Not so much that difference itself that lights up, the difference between presence, between beings and their presence, because that ontological difference, that's well established, as it were, in metaphysics. But the origin of that becomes erscheint, that comes into the light, and that is what the origin, that's what the essence of language is, the way I see it. So it's like a dub, it's like a rocket with two, First there is the psychological view, the metaphysical view of language. There's something in my head, and I put the right words to it, and then I utter it. That is left behind once we see that language stands in this, what he calls this Zwiefalt, this duality of being and beings, which is the light in which things appear. That's the charis, the moment and he uses this terrible German word Huld. I think it's glory is probably the way you say it in English. That's probably what the text says here. So things, So there's a glory of the world, and this glory of the world is the fact that things can be known and said, and that they come into the light. But they are not the light, as it were, and the human being is the one who is addressed to articulate that glory. And they say that's exactly what that's the ba of kotoba. Those are the leaves, the petal leaves, the blossom leaves. Koto is that where that comes from and where it points back to, and that is the stille, the silence, is that of which we can only remain schweigen über das Schweigen, which can remain silent. And that is a kind of something that it's not the threefold itself, but it is that from which that threefold comes. And the way he sees it is to say, so it becomes almost impossible to talk about it. So I don't know, the only word I want to say now is this tragen. So he uses the root trag, and then in tragen and zutragen, eintragen, which is also brauch. And actually those two words are related. I'll come to that in a minute. To say that in our response to the threefold that opens up, that is what it means for us to speak the language that is spoken to us. And that's why it is only in this Gespräch, this response to this address, that the essence of language can appear at all. Sorry, this is not very clear, but so it's not the case that we're looking for a foundation and we say, okay, so we're smarter than everybody else because we realize that it's not just metaphysics, it's not just ontological difference. No, there is something even deeper than that. That's not the point. The point is that in understanding what it means for us to speak with each other, Gespräch, that's where that original essence of language appears. So nowhere else. It's only there. Right? But we'll get to that maybe. Yeah, go on.
So I actually am really interested in the form. Well, the English translation, the title is a dialogue on language. So that seems as if this is just a dialogue which is recorded and printed and published as a book. But the German title is Ein Sprechen von der Sprache.
Yeah.
So that is from a Gespräch of or on language. Not sure. I mean, what I think is actually if you really concentrate on the original publication, so it sounds like it's just taken as a part taken from a dialogue and printed out and publicized. So in that case, it does not have to be a dialogue. So A says this, B says that.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, at first, I'm not so sure about the form, but within the process of reading, it feels like just you are reading a theater script, where you say, okay, there's this setting, and these two persons are talking with each other. So I think in comparison to just reading normal text and article, it has this effect that you're invited, that you're also invited into the conversation itself, which is about or of language. Yeah, what that is, what's the vision of language, and somehow, you know, at least it's my personal experience that I brought to the position where I try to reflect on the language that I know. That in order to just to not think language as a pure instrument or just a medium, but there's something just behind it, but just purely through the effect that I read this dialogue of language or on language, that I feel really invited to participate.
Yeah.
Is that because there's so many questions get posed and it kind of makes you think about how you might answer the questions if you're in the Japanese's position?
Yeah. So the thing is, okay, I think if it's really like in the classical Platonic dialogue, probably I will not have this kind of feeling, because in Platonic dialogue you always have, there's one person who just lectures
The other person was like,
yes, yes.
so just looks a little bit dumb. So says, so what does it mean? So that means I'm wrong or what? And there's also the other person who lectures. It's more like you have a, you know, the orthodox like teacher and student. Student always listens and teacher always says this is wrong, this is right, you shouldn't follow like this. But this is not. This is like mutually, because they are from so different cultural backgrounds. And the whole structure of not just grammar, but also the structure of the character itself, because it's not letter anymore, it's characters. It's quite different. So you kind of feel that there is a gap. They try to have a dialogue with each other, but sometimes it just pass like this because they have quite different understandings. Like, and also the senses, I don't know, Wahrnehmung of perception of language. So kind of much more easier to, at least for me, to feel like invited in comparison to Platonic.
Because they don't assume a certain perception of language from the start, and there's two alternative conceptions that it leaves open as to which we should adopt.
Something I found interesting that you said was that it feels very mutual and more mutual than Platonic dialogues. What is also interesting is that we have only one Fragende. So Heidegger is setting the Fragende up against an entire culture, sort of very generalizing of Japanese philosophy. And so you don't have like the Western philosopher and the Japanese philosopher. So in that sense, something that I was troubled by was the fact that it's the Fragende the whole way through and the Japaner, rather than say two Fragenden. But the Fragende does say at some point, let's switch roles. So there is an attempt at mutual Gespräch, but I think the Fragende is very aware that he's situated within his Western culture, and so he can only speak out of that context. And so I think this text is very self-conscious, to the point of irony, I think. I think that, as you say, we're invited to reflect on this conversation that's unfolding. So when könnte ba is translated as blätter, as blossoms, so it's so stylized, it's so cliche. It's very kind of cliche Japanese image. So I think there's kind of almost some irony going on there when the Fragende leaps on that and says, oh, of course, that's exactly what I wanted to say, cherry blossoms, that's what language is, yes. So I think that stylization is also an irony that invites comment as well. That's kind of where I was going, was picking up on the idea of, is this a mutual conversation or not?
That's a very important point.
So what would Heidegger be trying to say by employing that irony? Do you think that something like it's not as simple as a made-up book, or you think he deliberately chose with the blossoms a cliched example?
So as you mentioned, this is based off actual conversations that Heidegger had. So there's, again, I can't remember the name of the student he actually spoke with, it begins with T, I can't remember it. But he asked the Japanese student at one point what the Japanese word for, I think it's word or something is. And then the Japanese student says, well, okay, so it's something like this. And then Heidegger says, okay, that must mean ding, das ding. And then the Japanese student says, no. And so essentially Heidegger keeps trying to kind of leap on these Japanese words and say, but that's what I've been trying to say all along in my philosophy. So that actually happened in those conversations. And so it's arguable the degree to which Heidegger is conscious of his own kind of over-eagerness to acquire Japanese words into his own vocabulary. But I think, for me at least, it's so stylized it feels basically like irony. And also I think that that kind of mismatch is also necessary in the text, because a completely balanced dialogue doesn't actually exist. it's an ideal, it's an absolute, and so there has to be a constant moving to and fro, a constant negotiation, a constant imbalance, being balanced again, imbalancing, and so on. So it's the kind of the power, if you like, the shift of power is always in motion, as it were. So the Japanese person at one point says, well, that's not what that means in Japanese. And then the founder at another point is trying to claim a word kind of for his philosophical vocabulary. So do you see what I mean? There's kind of, there's always a shift going on, rather than an ideal two completely equal individuals. Do you see what I mean?
But may I ask you, if you assume that this irony that you find is completely conscious, what do you think is the role of this irony inside the dialogue? Because I don't think it's something comparable to, for example, the Socratic irony, because the Socratic irony is only aimed to destroy something and maybe repeat. In this case, maybe it's something, it plays a different role. Maybe it emphasizes a difficulty, but not by means of destroying something and rebuild the same thing. Yes.
So, can I say? So I didn't understand its irony. To be honest, I didn't understand like the whole part of kotoba and cherry blossom. I can't.
Well, I don't understand how kotoba as cherry blossom.
Yeah.
I don't. That's.
Well, actually, for me, it's more like at first I just got so confused and distracted, right? Because the whole time is about this aesthetic theory and aesthetic idea about iki, and how like the Japanese word for light and the word for emptiness was like, what does it have to do with anything with language? But then it's my personal interpretation. So of course, there's always this kind of aesthetic effect of language. For example, when you read a poem, if it's in your mother tongue, you understand quite differently in comparison if it's translated into another foreign language. There are some of aesthetic perception that you might only understand it or get it when it's in your mother tongue, especially in the case of poetry. What I think is, of course, it's not like completely absolute balance, and there are also things that one tries to say, but the other cannot understand because he doesn't come from this linguistic background. So there's constantly something that is missing or overinterpreted. So how it appears to me is like, also when reading this conversation, also just reflecting on your daily conversation. With, for example, all in London, we all have some contact with people who are not English native speaker, or we all have experience speaking foreign languages. This is actually appears to me this whole aesthetic effect, which also has influence on our understandings, where you have this kind of emptiness, you don't know how to fill it in because you don't have the word for it because it's not your mother tongue. It's like when you open up a dictionary, you have a word, and this word, for example, this word, German word, and the translations in English, you have 3 or 4 translations, but it is a contextless translation. And every time when you put the word in a context, in a sentence, in a paragraph, it has something more. And this something more comes actually from the context that is not able to be translated just in a dictionary. This is how I understand, so you have light, but also there's always emptiness when this thing is set against a certain background. But I don't understand the paragraph.
Do you think maybe kotoba is perhaps the fact that it is translated as cherry blossom here, do you think that's highlighting the fact that kotoba is a contextless translation of Sprache in this text?
Like I said, I don't understand the part of kotoba. So
do you think, I find it interesting what you're saying about contextless translation. Do you think that that's the kind of translation that's happening in this text? Or do you think they're interested in context?
When I read kotoba, actually reminds me of Benjamin's article of Alva, where he said, try to give an aesthetic theory about the traditional art objects where this thing is just made by one person, one certain time, it's a one-time experience, and you have this aura. And how he describes aura is like you just imagine you're sitting beside the lake, and it's sun going down, and you see from afar there's a tree, and there the shadow of the tree is just changing, and you get the whole feeling of the natural atmosphere. But this is something that is just once. You cannot replicate it. So this is how I understand like kotoba, because I try to understand with this kind of East Asian aesthetic understanding, where you kind of always introduce the play of light and sun, light and shadow. So it is cliche, of course it's cliche, but it's also, because it's very traditional, it has been repeated over and over again during the whole history. So that is probably the reason why it's cliche. But it's like only with the help, the support of the sun that you see shadow, and probably it's not the light that you're supposed to see, but the shadow that you're supposed to see, which give you some aesthetic perception.
Yeah, I think that's very clearly present here. And you see that also in the traditional Chinese scroll paintings, the black and white scroll paintings, where very often you have there is a fill, the field on one side of the page is filled with form, and then it becomes empty towards the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a disbalance. Yeah, but that's precisely the point.
And wasn't there a text called In Praise of Shadows? Is it by Tanizaki? Which talks about the similar idea, the kind of the play of light and dark. I think it's early 20th century, so that would kind of fit into this context, I suppose.
So what about irony? Because you made a comment about, is it really ironic? And how does that relate to Socratic irony, which I think is very, very good observation. Or is it ironic because we want to see the irony in it? Because it would be too painful if it wasn't ironic.
It's very modern to see that.
Exactly. Well, I was reading the Black Notebooks, and there's a point at which Heidegger he says Heidegger egged, and I wonder how seriously someone can do that, to kind of etymologize their own name and then turn the second half of it into a verb. So I kind of wonder, and also he keeps using the word, he starts using the word spiel later, I can't remember exactly where it is, but
that's right.
he says you've got to allow the spiel of the conversation to unfold. So I think, in a sense, the reason why this is a dialogue, and also more generally in the context of the whole collection, I think Heidegger's being more open about his style. I think in a text like Sein and Zeit, he considers his style as a method, a Methode.
Yeah.
And I don't think he'd describe what he's doing here as a Methode. So maybe irony is the wrong word, but I think the self-consciousness of the style is there, and I don't think that he's asking you to accept it wholesale in the same way that he would ask you to accept a Methode. Do you see what I mean? So I suppose I'm using the word irony because I'm saying that this invites a critical eye. I don't think he actually believes in all of the terms that he introduces, and that's also the reason why this is written as a Gespräch, because every term that's introduced is questioned by the other person.
Yeah, and this is also the way, I think, in which he speaks about the hint inside the dialogue.
Yeah.
So maybe the dialogue itself could be considered one hint, or he uses these two words, the hint or a gesture. Yeah. And so maybe when he talks about a hint or a gesture, he describes the operation itself of writing a dialogue, which is an attempt to write something which stays outside of the classic metaphysical frame, which contains the sign or the shifter, not so the pronunciation, the shifters. Okay. And so trying to avoid those kind of representation, and in order to to find a way to express something, such as the nature of language. He, let's say, tries another, I had to say another method, because maybe I'm too embedded in metaphysical way of thinking, but he uses other instruments, he uses other way of expressions, which are hints or gestures. And maybe it's precisely because we are not used to see them inside a philosophical context that we maybe perceive something like irony inside them. But my point of view is that there's not the intention to be ironic in the strict sense of in the strict sense, or in the Socratic sense, or in one of those meanings of the word ironic. Sure, it's in several passages he's really he provides cliché, yes. But the point that in suggesting a cliché is probably that of showing that inside or just behind that cliché lies something as the nature of language itself, which is not exactly the content of the cliché, but is more the way in which this cliché is included in the dialogue, if it makes sense what I'm trying to say.
It's hard to say, yeah. I mean, it seems to me that, well, on this word method, I think it's a very central word in this whole book. It's even in the title. So Unterwegs is the science-denkerische substitute for methode. It's the same word. It means methode means to be on the way. Hodos, that you are going. Yeah, that's what it is. And in one of the later chapters, the concept of method is explicitly discussed in great detail. So there is definitely something about an awareness of this problem of method going on. You could almost, that's also a little bit facetious cliche, but you could say that this book stands in relation to this discours de la méthode. They are counterparts in a way.
So could this be an exercise in initiative? Is this a transcript?
No, not at all, no.
So this is a monologue.
It's a written text. It's a monologue.
It's a monologue disguised as an objective, because he's challenging himself with the external eye of a person who's from a different culture.
Well, that would be one possibly that could be one way of reading it very critically.
I thought the similar thing actually, whether or not this is actually a monologue, because the Japaner uses Heideggerian language. So, it's speaking Heideggerese. But the thing is that, like, so it's not a dialogue in the strict sense that it's between two distinct individual beings who each think for themselves, but perhaps it's a kind of like internal dialogue, if you like. So it's kind of Heidegger thinking to himself, as it were. So is it possible to have a conversation with yourself, I suppose? And if it's not, then this is a monologue.
But he is a kind of conversation with himself. That he's making the effort to be as objective with his own ideas as possible and ask himself questions is very admirable. This is not criticism. This is just me realizing that this could have been a text, a theoretical text, and he chose to take his own questions and ask them from the outside and then reply as himself to his persona. Which is, I mean...
It's certainly the case that he just makes one sort of cake under the table to Buber when he says, we hear so much about the Ich-Du-Beziehung, the I-Thou relation, but that's just philosophy of subjectivity. No? That's what he says in here. And I think that's not correct. I don't think that is what Buber was trying to say. Buber was aiming at a dialogue precisely in the sense of two people who think for themselves and who encounter or meet each other. Whereas here, And yeah, that is maybe it's a theme to think about. Here, Gespräch means to come into a bezug to language. So to allow ourselves to be addressed by language, to come into the Brauch, the use of language. We become the Botschafter, the messengers of language. So we are being put at the use of language, and then the Japaner then uses the word ware. So I don't know how to translate it. Goods. So we become things that are being used. And then he says, well, no, that's not what Brauch, to use, gebrauchen, what that means. So how I use it, I use it to mean that we are being made let's say the servants, the messengers, the ones who carry out a certain task with respect to language. But very far from, and when he says that ich du Beziehung is a philosophy of subjectivity, he means that is still coming from the idea that I sit here and I have my language and you have your language and now we start to talk. Well, I don't think that's what Buber is talking about at all. But you see, so, and you might ask a question what is this bezug of language? I looked also for a way to think about that. He said it's not relation, but it is bezug, and bezug comes from Beziehung. Beziehung means relation, but Beziehung has this ziehen in it, pulling. So it's like a vector almost. And the bezug is a kind of, it's not just a relation in the sense of A is the father of B or something, but it's dynamic. Language wants something from us, or it reaches out to us, and then you respond. And that's very different from a real dialogue. But whether it's a monologue, well, here we get maybe to the point where we say, how do we read a text like this? Do we put ourselves in a position outside of it and then see what's going on? Or do we take the author, if there is an author, at his word, that that this text should open us up, bereitstellen, which should make us ready, in some sense, to hear this, to be able to hear what language is saying.
So are you saying how much of a critical sort of objective approach towards it should we take? How many allowances to Heidegger's joy, to the way Heidegger goes about it? How lenient should we be on him in order to get the most out of it?
Yeah, exactly. He says himself, along the road method, along the path of the scientific treatise, we can never get close to the essence of language. It will remain forever cut off from us. And then he gives his alternative, and towards the end he starts to talk about Dichtung, poetry. So, if you want to understand a poem, you also don't, you don't approach it as a statement of fact or something like that. You have to somehow do something else. And he talks at length about interpretation, hermeneutics, which is, I think that, as I said, the Japaner has a kind of road that he travels, but so does the Fragende, because this notion of hermeneutics is deconstructed in the course of the dialogue. And he, of course, pretends that he already knew that, but still there is a kind of development going on, which shows that interpretation or hermeneuze, the way he talks about it, is this original being able to hear language. and it's something, but it makes it, yeah, I don't really think about it, but if you really go that route and if you just accept that, then there is no critical engagement with this possible at all. Yeah?
I mean, I found that interesting on page 4, actually. He says the danger of our dialogues was hidden in language itself, not in what we discussed, nor in the way in which we tried to do so.
Yeah.
Which I find very interesting in terms of the fact that this is a dialogue on translation as well. And how I read that is exactly the fact that another form of translation is translating meaning and thought into language. That's in itself is, making words is mistranslation, which also suggests that there is no way to speak language. Language in itself can speak through us, but we ourselves cannot use language because it's a misinterpretation of thought and meaning, which is very similar to Wittgenstein. And this is
Well, I mean, Wittgenstein would say that language doesn't exist, language with a capital L. There's German, French, Japanese, whatever. But so in that sense, you can't speak language. And so in that very strict sense, Heidegger's right, but I don't think that's what he's trying to say here. I think that he does mystify language to a certain extent.
mystify.
Yeah, but I think his way of talking about us not being able to use language is him trying to get away from this idea of us trying to grasp this essential idea of what language is, so the essence of language. So that's why he uses the word Wesen, and so I can't remember which other text it is, but he enjoys using Wesen as a verb particularly.
Yeah.
So he likes to see it as the normalization of the verb, and I don't know how you translate it, but I kind of see it as the experience of language. So this text is more about how we experience language when we talk with others, when we translate things, when we talk about particular languages. So when we talk about manifestations of languages, or when we are experiencing a manifestation of language ourselves, what does it feel like? And I suppose that links into his earlier interest in phenomenology, and I think it also indicates his later interest in therapy as well.
The point of therapy, I think we should discuss it. That's very interesting. But Wesen is not experience. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a verbum.
It's not a verbum, certainly not. It's experience in the sort of
It's
the way
experiencing something
pragmatists
happening.
will talk about
Yeah.
experience. It's, something happening, something coming into the light and being there, and so it's Aquinas. Yeah. It's It's not erleben, because erleben is again subject, and ervaren is also too quickly becomes subjectivity.
Particularly because those transitive verbs, erfahren, erleben, and I think Heidegger doesn't want a transitive verb that we can use because he doesn't want to think of language as an object, grammatically and also metaphysically.
Yeah, but sagen Wesen is a transitive verb where he uses it, sein based.
No, that's intransitive because it doesn't have an object.
Yeah, that's right, So I have in my head that he uses this verb also in a transitive sense. But, So hätte, I wanted to point out this sentence on page 133. So hätte alles Anwesen seine Herkunft in der Anmut, im Sinne des reinen Entzückens, des rufenden Stille.
Which page is that?
133. So Wesen, what I want to point out is he uses Wesen here in connection with Anwesen. And ein Anwesen is also is a noun. It can mean like something that you have, a farm, or an estate. Estate would be a word. Yeah. So hätte alles Anwesen seine Herkunft in der Anmut, im Sinne des reinen Entzückens, der rufenden Stille. It almost looks like a little farm that you see in the Bavarian mountain hills. Yeah? There is a kind of present sing, maybe is a way that the Anwesen is sometimes translated. It's a movement out of the Stille into the Anwesen, and once you into presence, and once you see that, then you see the Stille. But the Stille, and that's also a point that the Japaner makes, the Stille can only become audible, or we can only become aware of it through das Wesen, through das Anwesen, through the Gebrauch, through language.
Is there is that nothing and that's just this?
Yeah, I would say there's a strong connection here between Stille and nothingness. Almost as if, so he says we have to think more Greek than the Greeks. Yeah. Because the Greeks have this concept of Erscheinung, of appearance, which is not, of phenomenon, which is not what appears to a subject, but is the appearing into the light of things as they unfold out of themselves, physis. And that's ontological. That's Entbergung is truth as what's it called in English? Not disclosure, but
revelation, because unconcealing.
Unconcealed truth. Yeah, unconcealed. Yeah, unconcealed. So unverborgenheid. And he's trying to say we go into the essence of that. We go into that. That's Ereignis. So Ereignis is not Erscheinung, but Ereignis is, you cannot say Ereignis, but it's, you know, if you say in other words, that there is Erscheinung at all. And you need language to even become aware of it. And the Japaner says the same thing when he talks about aesthetics. He says you need the so Count Cookie was trying to say that you need the, I forget the words. You need the color. You need the color to have the. Come on. So he gives this discussion. Sorry.
So he gives this discussion a Western and an Eastern.
Yeah. So he has this Japanese phrase, not kotoba, but the other one. Iro and then something else.
Iro and ku.
Yeah, iro and ku. And then he says, and iro is color,
Yeah.
right? And ku is
Emptiness.
emptiness. And then he says, so then first they misunderstand each other, or you know. Heidegger says, well, I'm just talking about Sindig and Übersindig, the body and mind, that whole, you know, metaphysical legal, or are you saying something else? And he says, no, it's something else, because you need the color to have the emptiness. And that comes very close to Kotoba. And that comes very close to Anwesen and the relation between Anwesen and Stille, and why being brauchs needs man, the human being, as the place where Sprache can come into Erscheinung, so that Ereignis can, and then he doesn't say appear or come, but he says walten, so can reign or rule or yeah, so, I mean, he links it here to indeed the typical or cliche version of sort of East Asian philosophy as a discourse in which there is a notion of emptiness that escapes all sort of Western categorizations of being, and that requires a different way of thinking. But you could also say that the way he talks here about being more Greek than the Greek is that he says we need a notion of creation. We need a notion of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, and the notion of language that he plays the mysticism of language is something not very far removed from the mysticism, the theology of the word in Christian theology, where there's also the creating word of God that's spoken out of nothingness, and that's directed to man. Adam, where are you? And man has to respond. And responds in language, responds by language, and then the word becomes flesh. So that would take a lot of work to erörtern, but it seems to me that the critique of so there is a kind of almost, there is some kind of Christian heritage in the critique of the Greek beginning. And that has to do with this nothing, the status of the nothing.
Also,
Nothing.
do you know what's more Greek than the Greek? The German.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's, you know, in the
Yeah.
Christian by extension, because more Greek than the Greek
Well,
somehow became, you know, from pagan to Christian, and that's
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah. There will be no more Greeks and Jews, it says in the Bible. Yeah. So the
Just Germans, yes.
just Germans.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah, what's next? Okay, can I just ask one question? He says several times, among others on page 143, ein solches Sagen, sein Sprechen, könnte nur ein Gespräch sein. Why? So maybe we can explore this notion of the conversation a little bit deeper, of the Gespräch. Why does it have to be a Gespräch?
Where is that? Can you find it in the English?
So we're not just dealing here with a form that is just because he felt like writing a dialogue. No, it has to be a Gespräch. Das könnte nur ein Gespräch sein. Ja, das also ein Sprechen von der Sprache könnte nur ein Gespräch sein. This is towards the end. Speaking from absolutely dialogue, page 51. Only be. Or is that another rhetorical ploy? Certainly if we say that perhaps it is actually a monologue that we're dealing with here. Or is it not a question? Maybe, I mean, I just, it's a high-tech conversation.
Is this something to do with the hermeneutic circle? Maybe in like dialogue requires interpretation. You have to,
Could you speak
yeah.
up a bit?
Oh, sorry, yeah. Is it connected to the idea of the hermeneutic circle that he talks about at all? Maybe that dialogue as opposed to monologue requires interpretation. And it's like, I don't know, is he possibly rejecting the idea of the circle a bit later on, but it's like a continual movement, like back and forth. So the dialogue is a means of using language that has that kind of impetus to it, that it keeps going because it's always bouncing back and forth. Is that, I'm answering the question, I mean, why dialogue in particular?
It's yeah.
So dialogue and Gespräch, they're not the same. Gespräch, they're not the same thing exactly we were saying before.
Yeah, they're not the same, but we're using them now interchangeably, I think, until we found a better word in English.
I think Heidegger's playing on the link between Ein Sprechen and Gespräch, and so he's saying Gespräch has Ein Sprechen, but a dialogue doesn't have Ein Sprechen. And quite literally, dialogue is etymologically unrelated, but I think he's also citing a different tradition as well with dialogue, and so he's kind of putting himself outside of that tradition by focusing on this German root of Sprache, and he's kind of trying to show that he's trying to get away from the rationalist tradition, I think, which dialogue implies because of its different etymological roots. So I think that's why he's introducing Ein Sprechen, because it helps in terms of the idea of this sort of correspondence that's going on, this sort of to and fro. So the meaning is getting across what he's trying to say, what a Gespräch is, but also its link to Gespräch as opposed to dialogue helps him to sort of say, that's the kind of dialogue or conversation that I'm not trying to have, and this is the kind of conversation that I am trying to have.
He's moving from interpretation, he's moving from hermeneutics to Gespräch. Right? He's moving from hermeneutics, so I think that's that point about hermeneutic circle, that he discussed that right before that remark is indeed very, very pertinent. But he's sort of getting rid of this notion of hermeneutics, but keeping but going to what lies behind that, and that is this Ein Sprechen. Because hermeneutic interpretation means that there is something that's already being said, and now we try to make sense of it. And that's a circular process. So, but what is more original than the situation where you're interpreting is that first of all you've got to have heard something before you can interpret, as it were. Something has to be said already for that to be even a question of interpretation. So Gespräch is, just as we have ontological difference and then Aquinas as the essence of being, so we have interpretation, and then as the essence of that, as it were, we have Gespräch, and then this play of Sprechen and Sprechen. Right? So the idea that we can never get out of, well, you know, the idea is, and that links to the point about you cannot write scientific treatises about the essence of language. So the Gespräch is not just, it's not just coincidence or so that you can only in a Gespräch you can only speak of language in a Gespräch. It's essential, because language starts with, well, speaking starts with hearing, as it were. Something has got to be said before there can be anything else. And ultimately language speaks to us, or to the philosopher of language. The language philosopher is the one who can hear language. So yeah, the philosopher is the one who's put him or herself in a position where he or she can actually hear language.
So you can't speak about language, you can only do language, in the same sense
Yeah,
that
so-
we were talking about music.
You can't speak
And you
about
can
it.
write
Well,
about
you-
music, but if you music to comment on music,
Yeah. You can.
It's language.
You can.
Responding to language.
You can write about it,
Yeah.
and he says later on, linguistics is writing about language or studying language, and will go its merry way. As for what he said about science, science will go its merry way. We don't, as philosophers, don't have to worry about that too much. But the essence of language is only available
Within that system.
in the Gespräch. Yeah, exactly. And I think that seems to me that that is a very far-reaching claim. You know. That, yeah.
But that basically means like to be spoken, to be heard, and to be understood. Right? Like language being, I don't know, in a Gespräch. Because the thing for me is, every time when it's talking, the topic is about essence, it sounds really naturalistic. It sounds as if there's something, this reification idea of there's this ultimate truth about language. But I think, as you said, I'm not sure whether these can be translated in terms of essence. So the thing is, there might be a vision that the ontological being, ontological being of language, that is, what happens as an Ereignis in a Gespräch, that is being used, that not only humans try to use language to address something, but the language in itself also address like this understanding that people try to, communicate with each other. Is that what you're saying, that language in Gespräch?
Well, I was trying to think about what it means to say that you can only get close to the essence of language in a conversation. If you take that seriously, then what does that imply? He says also towards the end, conversation has to do with questioning, and we need to still discuss the role of questioning, which of course is a massive role because one of the interlocutors is just identified as the questioner. But we'll come to that in a minute. But then he also says, towards the end he says, a real Gespräch, a real conversation, you are pulled along by something, or you get into the Zug, into the pull of language, and that's what you're trying to that's what sort of sometimes happens in a conversation, or can happen, but it often goes wrong, and you don't control it exactly, and you have to be open to it. But he seems to be suggesting that only there can we come into this having as he says in one of the other chapters, an experience with language. Wesen, so this word Wesen, essence. So in German you have sein and Wesen, and in Dutch it's the same. And I think that he uses his own dialect a lot. But in Dutch we also have zijn and Wesen, and it both means being. But Wesen is a kind of, it's almost like the dynamic activity of being. Just as essence, of course, if you hear esse in it, the infinitive verb esse is also dynamic. So it's verbal. Actus essendi is the act of being at work, being. So you would say, you don't say it in German anymore, but I suspect maybe in his dialect you would say it. So, but in Dutch, if you say like to a child, be polite, then you wouldn't say ben beleefd, which would be the conjugation of is, or to be, but it would say wees beleefd, which means act politely. You know, so wezen is a kind of, means to be in the way in which you are, as it were. Yeah, I think that's how, and that's why essence is sort of misleading, because we have this natural, this reified notion of essence as this thing which sits there. But he retrieves that word Wesen in German because it has this. I think in German it's lost most of that verbal, but I think in Dutch it still has it. So for the Dutch it's not difficult to understand what he's talking about. You know.
Do you think that in this difference between Ein Sprechen and Gespräch, we can see also his own difference between one kind of truth, which is just correspondence, so just an adequatio on one side, and on the other side the concept of truth, which emerges in the dialogue, which is something that spontaneously gives as a mirageness. And so what he in this precise sentence is also trying to say is that if we are looking for what language truly is, the only way of finding it is let him appear throughout the dialogue itself. Let him appear throughout the language, and this appearance of language throughout itself could only be a dialogue.
Yeah.
Is it related to his conception of aletheia, in the sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes. I think that's very well remarked. Yeah, absolutely. But the aletheia of language, therefore, is Gespräch.
Yeah, in this sense, yeah.
Yeah. And not statement of fact or monologue or treatise or.
And this also has a lot to do with, let's say, the positioning of the speaker, or the positioning in general of man related to being, or the speaker related to language, which isn't central in the dialogue, because at the center of the dialogue there's not the speaker, rather the relation.
Yeah, exactly.
And so just in moving aside from the center, is it possible to let the essence, so the basin of the being and of the language to appear, and just in this movement of, let's say, step back from the center, which is exactly the peculiarity of the Heideggerian Kehre after the 1930s. So it's what he's trying to do, because on the other side, what he was trying to do before, especially in being in time, was to I don't know the English translation of the. I think in German it's Verstand and it's comprehension.
Verstand and Vernunft.
Yes, but when he talks about the essence of Dasein, there is, I think, there's Verstand und Befindlichkeit. These two. I don't know the translation of Verstand in English, but it's, I think, understanding or something like that.
Verstehen.
Verstehen, sorry.
Verstehen und Befindlichkeit.
Verstehen und Befindlichkeit. And when he moves from this conception of a truth that has to be, in a certain sense, not conquered, but a truth that displays itself within the use that the man is within the relationship of use of something. This puts the man or the Dasein at the center of the relationship. Whereas after being time, he puts this, he steps back and let's say he emphasizes the passive, the passivity also.
Receptiveness, yeah.
Yeah, the acceptiveness exactly of the.
Yeah. That's right. So that's part of this battle against the subject.
Yeah.
So the subject is the center that disappears, and that there's still a remnant of that in Dasein, in the concept of Dasein. Although Heidegger says why he starts with Dasein, because that's what we know about, and that's our access to the world. But here, that is completely left behind, because there isn't a question of access, or there is just a being addressed. So we are not the center, and that's precisely where we need to be in order to be what the human being is, to be of use to language. And so exactly, so the word Brauch is not our Gebrauch that we make of language in order to deal with the world, but it's the Gebrauch that language makes of us to allow this glory of the world to shine. And that's very, that sounds pretty, I mean, think of what he's saying here about hearing and responding in terms of our theological notions of prayer. I think there's a large parallel there between prayer is also grounded. So if you're a proper Catholic, prayer is not something that you do out of yourself, but you are already spoken to by God, and prayer is just an answer. Otherwise, it would be hubristic to think that we could engage in a speech act that would draw the attention of the Almighty if He hadn't already given it to us. I think all these, and he says it himself. He says himself in the beginning that if it hadn't been for theology, that he would never have found the way to language. He says that it's the. I thought that was quite extraordinary. Ohne diese theologische Herkunft wäre ich nie auf den Weg des Denkens gelangt. Herkunft aber bleibt stets Zukunft. As a Blockian, you hear that in very different ways.
You spend enough time with Bultmann.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Most probably.
Or Christentum, yeah. So those things are there. Yeah. But is this not all an elaborate metaphor? Maybe that's also your point about mystification. So you could say things that we know from how we use language, what we do with language, are being sort of put into this realm in which it is suddenly language that speaks. But isn't that just a kind of metaphor that what it does actually is it serves to keep people, Brauch is also custom. So it basically says the cultural world in which you are born, in which you find yourself, that prescribes the horizon of meaning, and so you have to fall in line with that if you are to be, and that's what the big other wants from you. And when you do that, then you are the place where language, where culture, where this Brauch, custom, can become real. That's maybe why he had made such a fuss about Japanese and German, etc., because he has quite an interest in keeping his culture pure. And so he has to go to this deeper level to talk about where they connect, where they are about the same thing. He doesn't want to give up the particular ways of his particular culture. So that, you know, that's maybe the question. Does the mystification serve, like as classical Marxist analysis, is it just an ideological superstructure for a culture that wants to keep on affirming itself and make the people in it subservient to the overall structure, which would be you know, a critique that you could also have of Wittgenstein's notion of the language game. That you know, it's a practice and you just have to accept it. It's a deeply conservative trait in both of them, which, you know, that's a question. It's a question. Where is that?
So,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, we talked about that also in terms of your chapter, probably.
Yeah, I'm not sure because, okay, the whole time we're talking about language or the language. So we're not talking about German or Japanese or Dutch, like specific language. So that sounds to me, at least, that there is something, I don't know, there's something common ground or this common thing of all the different specific languages have.
Yeah.
That somehow construct at least one aspect of human being, in being human.
Yeah.
So actually at first, how I understood is more like, is in the process of engaging with languages, and with language and with different languages, there's a possibility that people can probably acquire a better understanding in, for example, in being human as the kind of being that uses languages to communicate with each other. And also the whole concept of, you know, whether it's dialogue, whether it's conversation, whether it's Gespräch. So how it sounds to me is more like the more languages you are capable to speak, somehow there are more doors or open for you to kind of investigate this whole communicative being of human.
Yeah.
But then you now kind of turn the table and saying that, well, to be honest, I didn't see the idea of, you know, keeping the pure, because the thing is, well, of course, the languages can influence us. Once I learned languages, the whole the grammar, how the past tense, the future tense are constructed, kind of influence me in thinking about, for example, time and space. But then, if I really become aware of such nature, one specific language, then it means I turn myself actually not into an object of the language itself, but I turn myself into a subject that one is aware of using language because I know these rules.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense it's not actually, you know, this kind of passive picture of this whole relation between culture and human, but rather like, you know, you have to understand it so you know where you stand and you know what you have to investigate, you have to explore, and so that you become passive.
Mm-hmm. What do you think there?
I think that would also redeem your argument that Wittgenstein's idea of language game is conservative as well, because you're effectively saying that the more languages you know, the more access to different ways of thinking you have, essentially. And I think that's the idea, that's why Wittgenstein introduces language game. So in the philosophical investigations, he actually says, this is an analogy.
Oh, yeah.
It's not, he uses the word analogy. He's not presenting language game as a concept. He's not using it as an explanation of this is how language works and how it will always work. And he uses the analogy of game. So for instance, he describes someone watching people in a field kicking around football, and he imagines this person asking themselves, is that a game? Are they playing according to rules? And so on and so forth. And he imagines this person saying, yes, they are playing a game, they are playing a ball game. But it's also just some people kicking a ball around in a field, so is that actually a game? So by using the analogy of games with language, Wittgenstein shows how definitions can be flexible, but that doesn't mean that they're useless. So we can still have conversations about games. If I say, do you want to play a game tonight, you don't know exactly precisely which game I'm referring to, but you have a good enough grasp of the concept to understand what I might mean by that.
Do you want to play a game tonight?
Unpleasantly or pleasantly.
Yeah.
Asian there is.
I was thinking board games, but so there's a point towards the end of the dialogue where I think it's the founder says, well, maybe, or I can't remember if it's the planner, but shall we just give up trying to talk about language then, because we're never going to get to a kind of resting point. But the response is, no, we should keep trying. And I think, again, that links back to your point, sorry, about how lenient we should be, because where's the point of rigor in this conversation? Is this like a rigorous kind of discussion of language? Is it a very kind of relaxed discussion? And how does it help us talk of language or about language? Does it kind of make us more rigorous readers? Are we able to kind of use the concepts from different languages in this text to talk about language? Do we become more skillful, and as according to your reading?
Is that a question?
I suppose it is a question, yeah. Like, so, how, again, back to your question, how lenient do we have to be with Heidegger to get something out of it? Are we gaining more skillfulness? Are we gaining a kind of acceptance? Does that acceptance mean that the Gespräch about what languages stops? I mean, generally, did people feel like they got something out of this text?
Yeah, that's a good question. What do you think?
So for me, it's I personally, I don't think it's like, okay, if you said like a culture make use of us, or culture, how culture make of us. So how I understand, for example, is the influence how we think, and then under this influence we also articulate the meaning that we are capable to say, to express. So for me, it's more like a thing of understanding. If we imagine everyone only speak one language and also have only one knowledge of only one language, then it will be very difficult for people, like for example in this room, to communicate. But if we find the common language that we all speak, and we're able to talk with each other, for example, the least condition for a conversation or for a Gespräch to happen, which facilitate the understanding that we can talk with each other. So for me, I don't think it's about like there's this kind of mysterious nature or essence that lies behind language that we're supposed to investigate through mastering different languages. I think it's actually, it's in the other direction. It's more like because we understand the importance of language, and we also understand that there are different ways of thinking, which we can perceive through using different languages. So language is more like a way, it's probably cliche, but like concept. So human is actually the purpose, but not the instrument for it. It's more like people come together, able to understand each other, talk with each other, get not necessarily consensus, but like better understanding.
So do people understand each other when they speak with
Yeah.
each other?
So no. So what I think, of course, if you say
It doesn't matter for Wittgenstein and for Heidegger. It wouldn't matter at all if people understood each other,
no.
as long as they behave. well, maybe not for Heidegger, but well, maybe that's saying too much. But understanding is, of course, for Heidegger, it's tying again to categories of subjectivity.
So in his philosophy.
Well, you said it just now. So
Yeah.
the question is, do we understand each other? I think that the point of but it's actually a good remark. The point of the Gespräch in here is not for us to understand each other.
No,
Not to understand each other completely and absolutely, but to reach an understanding or be on the way to an understanding, to put it in Heidegger language.
Is that so? Is it not rather to come into ein Sprechen des Verhältnis zur Sprache?
And that isn't a form of understanding.
Yeah, but now
Maybe
you're
an
talking.
agreement, not an understanding.
It's not an understanding. It says, well, I understand what you're saying, or you understand what I'm saying. It is an agreement in the sense of falling in line with.
But I'd say that's kind of what understanding is, right? So if I say, well, my idea of Sprache is ABC, and someone else says, well, I don't understand the word Sprache that way, it's X, Y, Z. That's where they don't understand what I'm trying to say. If they do understand what I'm trying to say, they say, oh yes, it's ABC, yes, I agree with that, I understand what you're saying. And so I think that there is a kind of consensus going on in
Yeah,
understanding.
but you are talking about this kind of understanding. Either you understand or you don't understand. For example, do you understand that I'm speaking English right now? You will say yes. And for example, let's say
But is that understanding? I know that you are speaking English.
yes.
But that's not the same as
Yeah, but you
understanding. So for instance, you could speak English, you could speak a foreign language to me that I don't speak, and so then I could say, I don't understand that. But then you could speak French to me and I would understand some things. So understanding isn't a yes or no answer. There is such a thing as sort of understanding someone.
Yeah, but you can only know when you understand. So what my point is, you can always, in a lot of contexts, you can say I understand. But the point with understand is not the same with know, because you know that someone is speaking French or you don't know. But the understand is how well you understand. For example, you probably when you're 10 years old, your mom gave you a present, you don't like it at all. But after 5 years, you just all of a sudden, when you try to tidy up your room, you find this present and you try to think back and you get an understanding of this thing. So understanding is more like, it's not just I know it, this is a present, or don't know as a present, but you have to place it in a certain context, and you have different answers. It's like a degree.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Does this text tell us anything about what understanding is? It's a Gespräch von der Sprache.
May I
Does it?
just say this? I see two let's say, relationship of understanding. One is understanding in the sense of the, as I said before, agreement between the two speakers. So, for example, we can share the same opinion at the end of the dialogue, and so we understand each other. Maybe at the beginning of the dialogue we didn't share the opinion, then we discuss a bit, and at the end we share the same opinion, so we understand.
Or at least
this
understand why you
Sorry?
have that. So you could say maybe they start with different opinions,
Yes.
and then they end up understanding each other. Understanding doesn't mean that they have to share the same opinion, but rather that they understand, for instance, I understand why you hold that opinion now.
Yeah.
Whereas before, at the beginning of the dialogue, I had no idea why you could think that, but
Exactly.
now I understand why. And what was your second point?
And this is something like becoming identical in a certain sense to the other, because
But is it though?
my thoughts become identical to yours and yours to mine, so we share the same opinion, or at least we understand why the other is holding such an opinion.
But I think those are two different things. Becoming identical.
No, this is the
some
first.
sort.
This is one thing. The second would be something different, which is pointing out of the relationship of us, of the two speakers, and looking for something that is not included in this relation, but maybe it's something that allows this relation to be. So, for example, in this sense, this is a path towards something that is external to the single the two individuals or to the two speakers. And this is another way to conceive understanding, because in this second case, I'm not trying to understand you, and you are not trying to understand me. So we're not just trying to become identical, as in this dialogue. The point, what is at stake, is not understanding the Oriental culture or from the Western point of view, or vice versa. The point is that pointed to something that is external and that lays at the bottom of both the cultures. And this is another concept, in my opinion, of understanding, and which is exactly what is here at stake. If I'm
like an extension or an expansion of horizons.
Not exactly an extension of the horizon. I'd speak. There's a point in which they say, okay, we are speaking about the same. And this maybe it's just a very naive link to what Levinas says about something that is external. So basically, if the point in the dialogue would be just understanding what the other says, and the method or the means of this understanding would be a metaphor, could be a metaphor, could be poetry, could be something like this. We are, in any case, stuck inside the frame of subjectivity. But if we somehow, let's say, allow some other things from the external to show, from outside to show in this dialogue, which is not already included in this dialogue, in my idea and your idea, then this excess could be, could allow a second thing, the second way of understanding. So there's something else. In this sense, I'm coming back to the question whether this could be considered a metaphor. It's a metaphor if we are here just to, let's say, understand each other. I don't think it's a metaphor, or not only a metaphor, if we are trying to let the nature of language to emerge throughout the dialogue itself. In this sense, I don't think we can consider this a language. And this is, let's say, the ultimate aim of Heidegger in looking for the sense of being, without remaining inside the frame of the subject, as I can understand.
So is the space in between two different understandings?
What?
That was very
So yes and no. Like
Yes,
I think talking about the idea of the external and the space in between leads us back to this idea of your first model, which is two people trying to approach each other and become identical. But also I think that they're not, in a way, they're not talking about something external because they're always talking. They're always within language. And so that's why again and again it's repeated that they're not having a Gespräch über Sprache. So they're not talking about an external object, but they're talking von der Sprache. So they're both talking of language in the sense that's the subject of their conversation, but they are also talking from the experience of actually doing language right now.
Yes,
So
in this second sense, I meant external, not an object external.
Yeah. But as in something, but you could also say something that is common to both of them. So they feel that they have something in common because they say we are talking about the same thing.
They have a person.
So in that sense, I think that the word external is not entirely adequate, because if you talk about the word if you use the phrase they have something in common, then that links the two subjects.
But they do, they are friends. They're not strangers. This is not two strangers who are randomly speaking at a bar. These are two people who have
They share an
a
interest.
friend
at
and a
least, yeah.
teacher.
Yeah.
They share, at least they share an interest, yeah.
Yeah.
So they already share something in the sense that they have a common.
First of all, they
They have-
know
they have
that
a-
they agree. Actually, they are.
They have literally a communication, making a munus,
Trust.
making a munus shared, making a task or some kind of office or service shared. So that's not as communication. It could still be it could be almost as behaviorist as the model of at the beginning of the Philosophie and the list and the apples in the shop. I give somebody when we give this example, give somebody a list to go to shop, give somebody a list, takes the apples from the crate, puts them in your bag. That's a kind of coordinated behavior. That's maybe not understanding. But here, towards the end, well, maybe you can read it like that, but I think towards the end, something rhetorically very interesting going on, these last few lines, where they actually, I don't think they merge, but they start to sound like an ordinary couple. They are completing each other's sentences. Wie sollen wir dieses denken, als die Versammlung des Währenden, then the other one says, das wie sie neu gesagten Wert als das Gewährende, then he says, und dasselbe bleibt wie die Botschaft, and then the other one says, die uns das Botenkern braucht. What happens there? Is there an understanding now? Do they now finally, like you said, yes, we're talking about the same thing? Or has language here become the speaker through them to us, maybe as readers or something like that? Yeah. So are we now, what has happened here?
We don't know.
No, that's a question, yeah?
No, literally we don't know. Maybe if it went on, it would change.
Yes, of
It's
course.
open, so
They could always fall out of it, but so have they now? That would be the metaphor. That would be to read it as a metaphor. Have they now just finally the Japaner has become a good Heideggerian? He can now also speak the language or play the game, or is it the strong Heideggerian reading? Finally, the essence of language shines through their words. They have allowed themselves into the pool of language, and so we are actually, there are no longer speaking subjects in these last four lines. They are Stimme, they voice the Bestimmung of language. Or have they reached a subject-to-subject kind of understanding of each other in the mutual recognition that they are actually talking about the same thing? Which that would be sort of the humanist reading of Heidegger. and the first one would be the behaviorist reading, which would align Heidegger strongly to some of the aspects of maybe of the philosophical investigations. And the one in the middle, that would be the
I don't know, it feels like the dialogue is started here actually, which is very interesting because they started from two very different perspectives. It seems like they negotiated their differences until they found themselves at a place that they should now start discussing as two people who sort of understand each other. I don't know, that's how it felt to me. They found dialogue.
Yeah,
It's not, they don't have to agree, but they sort of found dialogue.
Maybe that's why the distinction between Gesprächen and dialogue comes fairly late on in the text, because they start to feel like, in the same way as if you say, we're actually having a conversation, this is great. So when you talk about having an actual conversation with someone and saying, oh, I miss having an actual conversation with someone, in that sense, so it kind of struck me that Heidegger is using Gespräch in this very Heideggerian way, but it also struck me in that sense that they found joy in this kind of what you're talking about.
Yes.
And so I think you're right. Maybe it is a kind of like it becomes a starting point.
So we started speaking instead of speaking about speaking, about dialogue. I mean, most of the dialogue is about how to have a dialogue. And then they start speaking in the end, but then it's rapid and it's small sentences and it's interconnected. It's not me saying it's a paragraph and then your paragraph about your culture and about we don't understand each other.
Yeah, it becomes
progressively it becomes actually a conversation.
Wechselrede, yeah.
If this is the form, I mean, I would have to sit down and see it as a form and see what they discuss and how it progresses. Otherwise, it's just an assumption. It would be an interesting form. That's what happens.
Okay, good. I think that was very, very good conversation. Thanks all very much. It leaves us to a question, and that's maybe also one of the most important things about it. But we will continue with these themes, of course. Now, I just wanted to, before we stop, quickly check, because in our German text, that actually the first chapter is this text, Die Sprache, which he also refers to in the dialogue as a secret lecture that for a long time he did not want to write down, and so there's some that we didn't discuss, the difference between speaking and writing. But that's at one point says it doesn't matter. Gespräch can be written down and can be in spoken words, but he does make a point of the fact that this lecture in which he tries to actually say sagen, which was to say the essence of language rather than talking about language, and that therefore didn't write down, probably because it could only in the moment be experienced, like könnte, which könnte also happens only in the moment. I think maybe that's the reason, and that is in the German text, the first chapter of Unterwegs, Sprache. It's not in the English translation, as we said, because it was published elsewhere. But I would propose that we actually start with that we do that chapter for next time. Is that okay with everyone?
Das English one.
Nee, die Sprache. Yeah. And then we go to das Lesen der Sprache, the nature of language, we then do the week after, the time after that.
So what's the English translation of that missing text?
Die Sprache is in poetry language thought, which just came out just a year before this one, also translated by Joan Stambaugh. And that's simply called Die Sprache. I think that would be good for us to do that anyway, and then to go into, because the main body of the rest of the text are these three lectures that form a unity on the nature of language. That's also where it talks about where the question of method comes in. But if that's okay with everyone, then we do Die Sprache for next time.
And the next time is the 29th.
Yeah. Excellent. A lot to think about. Yeah. It is in the text, isn't it? No.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Die Sprache. Yeah, it's the first Abschnitt. Yeah, we also didn't talk about the fact that he talks about the vice of wissen wollen. So to want to know, which is just Neugier or Gier nach Wissen.
And next actually begreifen.
And begreifen as grasping, the beherrschen, dominating.
And so that was why I was looking at therapy, is this kind of sense of letting go of that desire to grasp what language is and to have a bit of a more, well, for want of a better word, lax approach. And so that's why I'm so interested in Heidegger and Rigger, is he just proposing that we all just chill out a bit.
Exactly, but I think that's a really important point, which has to do with this passivity, receptiveness, Gelassenheit.
But then
And that's how we
Gelassenheit
approach
is interesting
text.
because Gelassenheit he thinks is a practice that you can become rigorous in.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, well, personally, I think this is one of the big problems with Heidegger is that he wants to be rigorous about being lax.
Yeah.
So that's his, and I think that's closely linked to Adorno's critique of Heidegger. He wants to be, so he says you can't talk about sein, but in the end he gives a fully prescriptive version of what it means to think being. And so he isolates it into a thing of its own. And so in the end, it just becomes a reification. And that would link in with his connection to fascism that we touched on last time, which was also the celebration of strictness. But what he wants to be strict about is that there's no strictness.
That's very Greek as well.
It's like I told you, relax.
Why is no one relaxing? I think that's where he picks up from with Wittgenstein, because you were saying earlier about how Wittgenstein's ideas of language games are conservative, and Wittgenstein says that we should stop all erklären, we should stop all explanation, and just go only to And I think that leaves some people in difficulty, because if you want to continue in philosophy, then how do you tell what a better Beschreibung is? And I don't think philosophical investigations answers that.
No.
And I think it's a question that still troubles Heidegger in the late philosophy, even though he has the similar ideas to Wittgenstein about being we need to leave language alone. We shouldn't feel that we need to interfere with language. But there's still a better way of having a Gespräch.
Exactly.
So Heidegger wants both.
Exactly. And maybe that's also what the therapist, maybe that's also a problem of therapy. This prescriptive stance very often in therapy, and where in anti-psychiatry, so where that's been let go, you don't experiment with that. But so, who are you to say that you can therapize somebody else? So interesting. We have to explore that link to therapy. I think because so that's the ethos of this dialogue is about that. How do you, it's not so much to tell us what language is or is not, but how do we approach a question like that? How do we allow ourselves to be drawn into a discussion where something might happen that we hadn't already planned or thought out, that we hadn't. I think that those are very important things. And the extent to which Heidegger himself falls victim to the classical philosophical illness of saying I know.